didn't get poor on it. These are primarily the result of systemic or institutional racism. Right. So why have we been doing all this historical study? We've taken this deep dive into the U.S. history of the U.S. because it turns out that knowing our history makes an enormous difference for how we understand the morals of our contemporary world. Consider this graph, which I think I've shown every week, showing the wealth gap in contemporary U.S. Think about how differently you would interpret this chart if you didn't know any of the history that we've just studied. Someone from Mars might look at this chart and deduce that white people are smarter, more industrious, and more business savvy than black people. These racial inequalities might look like everyone has actually gotten what they deserve. And it would then be reasonable for them to argue against government programs designed specifically to increase black social standing. That would seem unjust to these Martians. They might insist that affirmative action programs in college admissions are examples of reverse racism. But when we study the history, we know better. The enduring racial inequalities in America are most easily and coherently explained by these enduring embedded practices of discrimination that we've been trying to chart. So what does all this mean for us here and now in the present? How should we understand our moral situation as a predominantly white congregation? And the million-dollar question is, what should we then go and do? Here, the history can only tell us so much. On the one hand, Americans have tried a lot of things to repair racial divisions and to live up to our ideals. Abolitionists tried starting mass campaigns and even starting slave revolts. Legislators and jurists have passed laws and issued court rulings. American citizens have organized movements for racial justice, and they still do. All of these methods on their own and together have led to real progress. But on the other hand, there have always been other Americans who have taken great pains to undercut this progress. This back and forth between progress and backlash used to be a lot clearer when the bad guys wore white hoods and burned crosses, and the good guys marched for justice in the streets. But now that we're in this period of covert racism, it's become a lot more difficult to figure out how to get on the right side of history. In fact, the line between racial progress and racial backlash gets even murkier when we look closer to home. The story I've been telling so far has been a story of an evil that began in a land far, far away and in the distant historical past, and each week it's gradually gotten closer to us here. And this morning I want to bring it even closer by looking at the phenomenon of implicit racial bias. It's here in the very depths of our own souls that we find perhaps the most insidious remnant of the evil that we've been studying in history over the last 4 weeks. The same movement between progress and backlash that runs through our history and our neighborhoods and our bank accounts also runs through the human heart. Now, it's really hard to find language to talk about such an all-encompassing and insidious form of evil. So in our final session today, I want to make the strongest case yet that where our ordinary language and concepts for talking about racial justice fall short, Christian theology might actually offer us a way to name an evil that drenches our history, that distorts our society, and that twists the way we perceive and feel about one another. So our concluding class is called Evil Lies Close at Hand, America's Original Sin and Christian Responsibility. And this is research from the book that I'm working on and kind of my own sense for where things are. So, the fact of anti-black racism's persistence in American life is undeniable. I've been trying to make that case for the past few weeks. The racial disparities in every marker of social well-being bear this out. What is puzzling is precisely how anti-black racism continues to prove so tenacious. After all, social psychologists have shown that even while these vast racial disparities persist, the levels of explicitly racist beliefs and attitudes have declined sharply over the 20th century and into the 21st. So what explains what Orlando Patterson here calls the puzzle of persistence. This has led at least one prominent sociologist to argue that contemporary racism in the US amounts to a racism without racists. Eduardo Bonilla Silva argues that he defines racism as the ideology of racial difference and hierarchy, but the real driver of these disparities between white people and people of color lies not just in our ideas about race, but in the material structure of white supremacy. These structures are norms, material conditions, disparities in wealth, consolidated poverty in cities, etc. This is what keeps white supremacy in place long after the ideas and attitudes about racial hierarchy have gone the way of the dodo. In my view, these structures are crucial for understanding racism's staying power, and yet the ethicist Jorge Garcia, pictured here, argues that we miss an important dimension of racism if we think in exclusively structural terms. Garcia fully agrees that structures of white supremacy really exist in our world, but he thinks that the ethical significance of these structures concerns the way that they twist our moral perceptions and our intentions towards one another. The way that I was describing, the good intention to educate your kids in good schools can lead to racist effects. To live and breathe amidst white supremacy cultivates vices in the soul, he says. Sometimes as forms of hatred towards people of a certain race, sometimes merely as forms of moral insensitivity to the suffering of those people on account of their race. So I want to make 3 claims today with regard to these debates about the ethics of anti-black racism. First, there is a deeper dimension of racism's persistence in American life that is not simply a social structure, nor is it an individual vice. The phenomenon of implicit bias suggests this. So that will be our window in. Second, I want to show that the implicit biases that we find in laboratories all across the country occasion a strange kind of moral failure that shatters the existing categories for understanding moral agency, what it means to be an actor. And third, the most provocative claim, I think, is that Christian theology, and in particular, the notion of apocalyptic soul death that we find in Paul's letter to the Romans, can actually help us get at this dimension of racism in U.S. life and understand the kinds of moral failure that it generates. So, here they are.
We were listening.
Yeah. If AI could just kind of sort this out for me, run my slides for me. So the first step here is to explore the phenomenon of implicit racial bias. I'm sure many of us have heard about this, but what actually is it and how does it work? Well, first thing to say is that implicit biases are different than explicit ones in 2 ways. First, we have implicit biases unconsciously. These biases can be triggered within us, and they can influence our decisions and actions without our knowing that it's happening. They often contradict our explicitly held beliefs and desires and intentions. Second, these implicit biases occur automatically. They are triggered not by our intentional thoughts, but by something out in our environment. A face, a gesture, a symbol, or something else lying in the background. These biases influence what we see, how we feel, and even, in some cases, what we do. And because they are unconscious and automatic, they are extremely difficult to suppress or control. If these biases are unconscious and automatic, though, how do we even know that we have them? The answer? Fancy computers and experiments like the implicit association test. So this is a screen from one of these tests, and it kind of gives us a sense for how social psychologists know, or think they know, that such things exist. So if you were to sit for one of these tests, and you can, the Harvard Implicit Bias Lab actually has an online test you can take. Many of us maybe have done this. Millions of Americans have taken this, and it will tell you something about your implicit attitudes. So first off, you'll be shown a human face that is racially distinct, and told to sort it into a racial category, so either African American or European American. But those racial categories are paired with an evaluative concept: good, bad, lazy, hardworking, etc., etc. Researchers then measure how long it takes for you to make the right categorization, to put the face in the right racial box. And the results show that categorization speed up when the racial group, black or white, African American, Euro American, is paired with a trait that matches its group's stereotype. And on the other side, categorization speeds slow down when the trait is stereotype incongruent. So as of 2019, so basically you're going to sort that face more quickly as African American if the evaluative concept matches the stereotypes that are culturally circulated about black people, that it is bad or negative, lazy, prone to criminality, these kinds of things. And it will slow down whenever it's opposite. As of 2019, more than 26 million of these tests have been administered, and in a review of some 700,000 participants, more than 70% of white people demonstrated an implicit association linking black faces with negative traits like lazy, ignorant, and criminal, while they link white faces with positive concepts like diligent, smart, and friendly. Now, while the findings about black participants are more mixed, there is evidence to suggest that this implicit preference for white faces is not simply a form of in-group preference. That is, black people and persons of color also show evidence of preference for white faces, even though it's an out-group. So these can't just be the evolutionary mechanisms that we all have, that we like those who look like us. That's been long proven to be a deep product of our evolutionary inheritance. But because these show up in the people who these biases are against, we can infer that they are not simply evolutionary, that these are actually cultural products. These are things we get from the water, so to speak, by watching the news, by watching movies, by watching television. At first, this might seem like an interesting experiment and observation, but it must lack certain or much significance for the real world. Like, how many of us actually sit and take tests like this all day, and do those really bear out in real life? But studies of weapons bias and shooter bias quickly show how deadly these biases can be. So in this test, on what's known as weapons bias, participants are subliminally primed with a black person's face, or a white person's face, and then asked to decode a kind of blurry image of a weapon, or a cell phone, or some other metallic object. And gradually that blurry object becomes clearer and clearer and clearer, and scientists study when you can recognize the weapon, or the cell phone, or the garden tool as what it is, and how often you get it wrong. When the participants are primed with a black face, they tended to recognize weapons more quickly than when paired with a white face. And participants more frequently misidentified garden tools as guns following exposure to a black face. In short, the activation of an implicit racial stereotype linking black people with criminality changes what we see. The findings of shooter bias suggest that these biases also change what we do. Participants were presented with an image of a black man or a white man holding various objects. Researchers told them to press a button on the computer marked shoot if the person was holding a gun, and don't shoot if they were holding anything else. When the target was holding a gun, black targets were shot more quickly than white ones. And when targets were not holding a gun, participants mistakenly shot black targets more quickly than white ones. Furthermore, similar levels of shooter bias appeared in both black and white subjects. There's lots more of these. I've weeded through hundreds of these studies, so I could go on, but I just mostly for today's purposes just want to draw some conclusions about what this shows and what kind of ethical questions they provoke. First, these studies suggest that implicit biases against black people are pervasive in the US. They appear in persons from many different races, not just white people, but more common and more pervasive in white people. They also affect a broad range of psychological processes, ranging from how we deliberate about moral questions to our most basic autonomic fear responses, things that circumvent our discursive mind and even our conscious memory. Second, implicit racial biases are evasive. They evade conscious awareness, so we need these fancy computers to tell us about them. They evade our best efforts at intentional self-control as well. In fact, some studies show that the conscious attempt to control or suppress these biases, once we know we have them, actually exacerbates them, making them worse. This is called the rebound effect, that the virtuous attempt to repress a bias actually makes the bias compounded. And crucially, these biases evade both of the preeminent concepts that we use typically to understand racism's tenacity. They are not fully outside of us, in the neighborhood, in the culture, in the society, the way that material social structures are, which is what Bonita Silva thinks of racism, but neither are they fully ours. They do not line up at all with our consciously held beliefs or desires or intentions. In fact, people can have these even though they profess to be utterly anti-racist. So having right beliefs or good desires and trying to be a good, morally just person doesn't prevent these from showing up. So all of this is going on, and these biases seem to be deeply significant on a moral register, but the question is how? It's one thing to say that somebody is responsible for being an explicit racist, for showing hatred or antipathy or callousness towards a person because of their race. But it's another thing to say somebody is responsible for a behavior that they don't know is happening, that's the opposite of what they intended to do, and that is actually made worse by the virtuous attempt to try to suppress it. And yet, if you're like me, you have some sense, some basic moral intuition that someone who expresses such a bias is somehow responsible. How do we square these intuitions? It's useful here, I think, to draw a distinction between behavior and actions. Behaviors are things that our bodies do that may or may not be susceptible to moral evaluation. If I sneeze, and it means that I knock the coffee out of your hand, it doesn't make sense to say that I was being mean or violent as a person. I just sneezed. It was a behavior that I didn't choose, that I couldn't have stopped, but I still caused you some harm. But if I intentionally use my elbow to knock a cup of coffee out of your hand, it would make complete sense to say that I was being mean and violent. The last thing is an action. Actions are things we do as agents. It means, and it would make sense to attribute those things to us that we do on purpose, that we do with intention. The difference here between behaviors and actions hangs on the concept of agency. So what does it mean to be an agent? Traditionally, going back even to Aristotle, it means two things. First, we act as agents when we do something freely. That is, I'm not being coerced to do something, but I choose to do it. So if I were standing on a bridge over oncoming traffic and somebody walking across the street comes in and pushes me over the bridge, and I fall down and crash through the windshield of an oncoming car and I hurt that person, it wouldn't make sense to say that I did that. Right? I was pushed over the edge of the barricade. This person acted on me. I was the recipient or the patient of their action. Right? I was coerced into harming this person. The second thing about being an agent is that we're acting as an agent when we're doing something with the knowledge of what we're doing. So imagine that you're sitting for coffee with a friend and you see a jar of white powder sitting on the coffee table, and you use the spoon in that white powder to pour some of that white powder into your friend's coffee cup. And you think, of course, the whole time that this is sugar, and that your friend likes sugar in their coffee, and that they will be pleased by this move. But it turns out that there's a devious barista out there that has supplemented that with anthrax. And so your very action that seems normal and benevolent and friendly turns out to harm this person, maybe even kill them. It wouldn't make sense to say that I killed my friend, even though it was my action that moved the hand that... It would make sense to say that I was deceived, and I did something contradictory to what I wanted and intended, and maybe I should have checked the white powder to make sure it wasn't anthrax, but is that really my responsibility to go back and make sure there's no devious baristas back there? No. So traditionally, only bona fide actions that we do freely and that we have relevant knowledge of what we're doing count as actions. And only those are the kind of things that we can assess to be mean or violent or good and virtuous, etc. So it seems on first glance that these biases we don't know about, that we can't control, and that are more like cholesterol readings than things we actually choose, are behaviors and not actions. But is that right? Get all these loaded up here. So to crystallize this, imagine, again, two people working in a corporate HR environment. One of those people is an old school racist. He believes that white people are superior to black people. He wants his workplace filled with more white people, and so he intentionally hires white people even when there are more qualified black candidates. Now the second HR manager is an implicit racist. She believes in racial equality and racial justice. She goes to protests, she supports Black Lives Matter, and is trying to do the work. She wants her workplace to be more racially diverse. But she has one of these implicit biases that associates black people with unintelligence. So when she interviews candidates, she systematically favors white candidates, even when they aren't as qualified. Now consider the ethics of this. The outcome of these two behaviors is identical: racial injustice. We can all agree that this is evil. But the intentions are entirely different. The old school racist is ignorant and vicious, and the implicit racist is well-informed and at least trying to be virtuous. Did the implicit racist really commit an action? She really chose to hire white candidates over black ones, but was this intentional? Could she have done otherwise, given what we know about how evasive these biases are? And did she know what she was really doing? At least on the traditional view of moral agency then, these seem to be behaviors, not actions. And if so, the implicit racist is not really responsible. But that still doesn't set right with me. I'm leading you through a kind of thought process of how do we make sense of the morals of this, given what we know about agency and given what we're finding out about these biases. Well, another way to think about implicit racial bias is that they cause weakness of will. Weakness of will occurs when an agent is free to do one of two things, judges that it's best to do the first thing, and then goes and does the other thing. This should be very present to all of you, at least if you're like me. But here's an example. I know that turning off the lights before I leave the house is the right thing to do. Because of climate justice, because of saving money on electricity, it's always the right thing to do. But when I'm in a rush to get to work, suppose I turn around and look at my house here on 31st Avenue in South Minneapolis, and I see that I've left the kitchen light on. I say to myself, Packman, morality and climate justice demands that you turn around and turn off the light. Take the extra 30 seconds. No one's going to die if you're 30 minutes late to your class. People are gracious at United Theological Seminary. Just go turn off the light. And yet, I just leave it. If that resonates with any of you. I think that white progressives especially often treat other white progressives as committing this kind of weakness of will when it comes to race. We know that racial justice is important, but we just lose interest or lack the moral fortitude to actually carry out our plans, to go to the march, to have the difficult conversation with the racist uncle, to send our kids to the inner city school, etc. So the question is implicit racial bias weakness of will? Let's consider another example. This is what ethicists do. We tell stories and make up examples to test our basic intuitions about what the morals of these cases are. So in case one, Jill is a committed anti-racist working in an HR department. She's looking at two candidates, one black and one white, with roughly similar qualifications. But in her judgment, the black candidate is slightly stronger. But Jill finds herself conflicted. She felt more warmth and affinity towards the white candidate, who actually went to her alma mater and who was a member of similar social circles. She feels like working with this person would just be more fun. She knows that this isn't a good reason or a valid reason to choose the white candidate over the black one, but in the end, she goes with her gut and offers the white candidate the job. And as she walks home that night, she feels sick with guilt. She finds herself looking for ways to justify the decision, but when pressed, she ultimately acknowledges that these are just rationalizations. This is a case of weakness of will. Consider a second case. Suppose that Jill, same person, still has anti-racist commitments, but now she has an implicit attitude that links black people with unintelligence. She's evaluating the same two candidates, but this time, she's watching them give a public presentation and trying to judge them strictly on the merits. The black candidate gives an objectively better talk. If Jill had simply read the lecture notes without knowing the person's race, she would have judged that this was the better talk. But because this happened in person, and because she has this implicit attitude, Jill experiences the presentation as weaker, and reflectively judges it to be weaker than that of the white candidate. For this reason, she votes for the white candidate. Now, when she walks home that evening, she does not feel guilt. She might feel some disappointment that her office is not becoming more racially diverse. But that disappointment isn't directed at herself as an agent, because as far as she could tell, she did everything right. Her choice of the better candidate aligned with her judgment of who was the better candidate, which aligned with her experience of which presentation was actually better. There was no contradiction. This doesn't sound like weakness of will. It sounds like there was a distortion in her moral life that occurred even earlier at the level of experience that then went on to corrupt all of these later cognitively downstream processes at the roots. So some conclusions to draw from these examples. We're getting to the theology, I promise. The first thing to say is that implicit racial biases seem to be operating at a more basic level of human existence than our consciously held beliefs and desires and intentions. We are vulnerable to manipulation by social forces at an even more basic, affective, and embodied level. This distortion corrupts even good beliefs and virtuous desires. Those are not enough to make us immune to these distortions. And in fact, terrifyingly, it can buffer us from actually feeling the morally good emotions like guilt when we do something wrong. There's a place for guilt, that is to when you walk home and you realize you did something that wasn't in line with your values. And in the first case of weakness of will, the person could feel guilt, but in the second one, they've actually been buffered or kind of insulated from feeling guilt because it seems to them like they did it all right, such that we can't even detect these moral failures as moral failures. What we have here, I think, is a concept-shattering distortion. We suffer from something more serious and insidious than weakness of will, a distortion that seeps into our embodied depths, that shatters the prevailing ways we come to understand racism's staying power in American life, and that depletes the only things we have in our power to even begin to identify our errors and try to change our ways, that is, beliefs and desires. What we seem to be dealing with is something that lies between our material environment and our nature as agents. There is a more insidious power that circulates through cultural and social mechanisms, that seeps into the most basic point of contact between agents and our world, that distorts the affective, attentional, perceptual capacities that we have that tend to exclude black people from the moral community before we've even thought about it. And that this enervates the very resources that we would find to fund our moral conscience and to take responsibility. This reality is neither a personal attitude nor a social structure, and yet it seems to be deeply involved in making anti-black racism so recalcitrant in our lives. How on earth do we talk about that? My third claim is that we already have a way to talk about this very thing, but you don't find it in sociology departments or cognitive science labs. You'll find it in churches and sacred texts and seminaries. In a word, we're talking about sin. This passage is from the Apostle Paul, Romans chapter 7, verses 15 and following. Paul writes, "I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. I can will and choose what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good that I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do." This is convoluted, but he's trying to describe something very close to what we're finding in cognitive science labs. He goes on, "I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death?" And he concludes, "Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord." So in this passage, Paul depicts a soul that is fundamentally at odds with itself. It can know what is good, but it can't do it. And this rupture that he calls sin is one that human beings are simply incapable of repairing on our own steam. The symbol of sin seems like we're at least in the ballpark of what I've been describing so far. It names a deeply recalcitrant source of moral self-frustration, a power that saps our agential power to do the good that we want to do. But at least in this passage, Paul seems to focus exclusively on an individual I, a divided self. Surely this is insufficient to talk about such an expansive cultural and social dynamic like implicit bias and systemic racism. This is Ernst Käsemann, a German Lutheran biblical critic, who was an interpreter of Paul. So if we fail to acknowledge that for Paul, or this is true, this notion that Paul is only talking about an individual problem and not a social problem, is only true if we fail to note that for Paul, sin is never simply an internal individual thing. It is an apocalyptic power. Ernst Käsemann argues this forcefully. He was a mid-20th century German biblical scholar and theologian, and he famously argues that the I of Romans 7, this self, this divided self, is not just a self who's at odds with itself. It has actually been taken over, for Paul, by hostile, quasi-demonic, cosmic powers. Sin is an apocalyptic power in Romans that enters into the world. It increases and grows in strength. It exercises dominion and death. It even kills, makes war, and imprisons us, Paul writes. In this passage from Romans, as well as in other instances, sin is personified as a suprapersonal force, something bigger than the individual self. It is the subject of action verbs. It does things to us in the world. Yes?
Quick question.
Yeah.
What are you defining as apocalyptic?
Yes, apocalyptic means these powers of good and evil that are beyond us and that threaten to tear selves and the world apart, but they are not reducible to kind of our inner states. Yeah, good question. And it's drawn from Käsemann, who kind of formalized this interpretation. So So sin is a super-personal force that does stuff in the world, and one of the primary things it does is causes a condition called soul death. Soul death was a term of art in ancient Greek moral philosophy, and it describes a condition of unrelenting, normative unresponsiveness to moral instruction or training. Somebody who has experienced soul death can't be helped by further training or by being taught something. They have become unsusceptible to training. As New Testament scholar Emma Wasserman puts it, soul death occurs when one's ability to know and do what is good becomes imprisoned, enslaved, and even killed by the lower forces of the soul. She's working here. If I had more time, I would go into this, but this is Plato's vision of the soul as kind of having three parts. There's the appetites, there's the spirited part of us, and then there's the mind. And things go well when the mind sets the tone for how the whole soul works. And soul death happens when these lower aspects of the soul conquer the mind and make the mind its servant, so that there's no capacity for the mind to actually redirect where the soul's going. And this is Plato's famous image of the soul as a chariot. We have these passions and drives that are the horses that are driving us and making us act, and the chariot driver is the mind that tries to keep these propulsive forces on the right track. But of course, soul death happens when the horses take over and leave the chariot driver out of it. And this is maybe what's happening in the case with Paul, and it might illumine something about what's going on in racism. This condition of soul death is located on a spectrum that Aristotle describes in his Nicomachean Ethics. This spectrum describes the whole gambit of human lives, ranging at the left there from the person who is utterly brutish and has no control of their lives and is simply akin to the animals, non-human animals, all the way to this side, the Sophorsune, who is the self-controlled sage, the person who perfectly embodies the control of the mind over all of the other things. Now, between these two extremes, there are three terms that describe most of us most of the time. The morally strong person, second from the right, reliably does what is good. The morally weak person knows what's good, but occasionally fails to do it. This is the weak-willed person. This is me walking out of my home and seeing that the kitchen light's on, but leaving it. And when such a person messes up, they are responsive to instruction and training. Somebody, perhaps my pastor at home might say, like, did you leave the lights on as you went to school today? And I'm going to be like, you're right. You know what, thank you, Sarah. I messed up. I should go and do that. Just hypothetically, that is a scene that might not work. But that means that I'm still trainable. I'm still responsive to reasons. Could have chosen another example. But this is different from the person who is a moral failure, from the agolastus. This person cannot be rehabilitated through instruction or training because they've lost the power to choose. They do not so much decide to do evil as they find it automatically, unintentionally, without freedom to do otherwise, pouring forth from their being. It simply flows forth into the world from them. I think that this is finally a more adequate way to understand our condition as agents who live in the afterlives of Americans' founding moral horrors. So, implicit racial bias as apocalyptic soul. So this will get closer to these terms that we're defining here. So in addition to racist vice in the heart and white supremacist structures in the world, there is a more insidious power out there that circulates through society and culture, that infects the most basic point of contact between us and the world, that distorts what we see and how we perceive one another, that excludes black people from the moral community at the moment of perception, and that innervates the very powers that we have, like beliefs and desires, that are required for moral motivation. My claim is that this is well understood theologically, as what Paul was talking about as apocalyptic soul death. It is apocalyptic because it's generated by a suprapersonal demonic force that ripples through American history in the wake of our founding moral horrors. It is soul death because it describes a condition in which the worst parts of the soul, that which have been distorted by the legacy of anti-blackness, effectively defeats and kills the best part, the ability to detect our moral errors and to see how to do good. This has become so embedded that the self-contradiction and moral self-frustration becomes the norm. It becomes unrelenting in us. And yet, as Paul puts it elsewhere in Romans, such creatures are without excuse. Now this might seem harsh, but actually, it's a way of affirming that those who have suffered soul death remain agents, at least to some degree. It's just that on Paul's view, the freedom that we need to be an agent, the freedom to identify and resist the apocalyptic power of sin and death in our lives and our world, the freedom to turn and live a new life is not finally our own. That freedom, that power is given to us as a gift from God. In fact, on Paul's view, it was only in light of this divine gift that any of these apocalyptic powers of sin even show up as sin in the first place. Before any of this was revealed, people just went on sinning, and sin just poured forth from us. We didn't even know that there was a problem. It just felt normal. But upon receiving grace, these all of a sudden appear to be a problem. And we feel some pain at that, because it doesn't seem like we have the resources to overcome it on our own. So to conceive of implicit racial bias as sin, even to recognize it as a form of unfreedom, of being alienated from God, is itself an indication that somebody is already caught up in the freedom and power of God. A power that promises not only to reveal sin as sin, but also to overcome it. The idea here is that even beginning to see this as sin indicates that we have been caught up in another apocalyptic power that is God's, Holy Spirit, that has revealed that there is something amiss in how we perceive one another, and that even if we can't overcome this through training and instruction, that we might yet be redeemed by this power that is not of us but can become ours. Right, that is bringing some theology to bear on this. I hope you've seen how it's trying to say that there's things about social sciences, social psychology, race theory, etc., that illumine a lot about what's going on with race, but we actually have, there's things going on in racial life in America that actually elude all of those concepts, and that require us to turn to things like the ancient religions of the world as wellsprings of wisdom for even understanding what's going on, let alone beginning to respond to it. And so this is a kind of Christian response to it, but it could be that there's Buddhist and Hindu and Muslim and Jewish responses too. This is just one way for us to think about how theology and the things we talk about here might actually speak to the culture and these moral problems that we find today. So, thank you for your attention for today's concluding lecture. I think we have a good 10 or 15 minutes to take any questions or comments. Yes?
Just regarding the word apocalyptic,
Yeah.
I think myself and many others associate that with like the end of the world. And so I'm wondering if we could substitute spiritual for apocalyptic. Because you talked about apocalyptic powers, spiritual powers, that encompasses both good and bad, right? Satan, John. Anyhow.
Yeah, good. This is a good point of clarification, because apocalypse can sound like the book of Revelation and the kind of end of history and the culmination of this whole drama. I mean, apocalypsis is the Greek term. It just means revelation. It means what is revealed. And when we talk in biblical studies about these powers, These are broader forces of good and evil that threaten to tear the universe apart. And that for Paul, this is part of what, this is how God in Christ figures into this. That in fact, there are forces that are trying to pull us apart from the very Garden of Eden, and that in Christ, God is actively working to bind these up and to set the world to rights by countering these evil powers with the Holy Spirit. So spiritual would be, I think, would be a fine substitute, as long as you don't think about spiritual as something that's just within us, that's just our own kind of personal relationship with Jesus, but that has this kind of broader social effect. Yes?
I just want to make a comment on the morality.
Just so that we can hear on the recording.
I just want to make a comment on morality, and sometimes people get on their moral high horse, you know, that it's so black and white. Very appropriate for the racial discussion. But I think of Les Mis and that police officer, this is Jean Valjean, because he stole a loaf of bread. That was wrong, that's it. There was no understanding or coming to terms with the situation. So morality isn't always 100%. I mean, it's a gray area.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. So the questions about morality and are there kind of absolute rights and wrongs, and what about these kind of fuzzy gray areas like Jean Valjean, who steals a loaf of bread, which is officially against the law, but who is trying to feed a family that is starving. Excuse me. I think that this is a great point, and it's easy to kind of go from there to say like, well, there's nothing right and wrong, and it's all just kind of up to us. Part of what makes Jean Valjean a morally good character is that he's trying to do something good. He's trying to feed his family. And there might be cases where suspending obedience to the law, whenever it means your family's going to starve, might actually be morally good, might actually be morally justified. So this is the kind of tricks that ethicists spend our time writing and thinking about. And these examples of people in hiring departments and HR departments trying to figure out what is actually the right thing to do, it requires really fine-grained analysis, because in each of these cases, really, even with the same effect, there's lots different going on a moral register. It gets really tricky. We saw this last week with the question about like, where do you put your kids in school, and how do you pass on your wealth to the next generation? Does that actually mean that you become complicit in perpetuating racial injustice, even though it seems like the good thing to do? And so these dilemmas are worth thinking about. And I think it's the kind of thing that churches do well to discuss together. That actually having groups that get together to discern together about these kinds of questions prevents the kind of vicious circle of us just telling ourselves to do what we feel best about. That sometimes our fellow Christians can actually put pressure on that. Yeah, Ron.
I just wanted to emphasize the class or what the teachings that you're doing with the stereotypes.
Yeah.
I work for a major organization, and one of the things that I did from a diversity standpoint was to have that type of class with employees. And what we would do is just give them a picture of people who are out of context. So as an example, I had this one photo of these black guys, and a couple of them had their shirt off, and some of them had their shirts on, and they weren't dressed professionally and everything. And every time I would have that picture out, people would come back and say, oh, they're in a game. They're in a game. And what was so funny about it, two of these black guys were lawyers, two of them were financial analysts. So it was just about the look and just automatically stereotype them. I had a young lady that was in the photo, sitting in a chair, had on high heels, short dress, everything like that. And every time it came back, said, she's a streetwalker, she's a prostitute, she's a woman of the night. No, she's not. She's the vice president of a whole company. So the stereotypes. And we never, I don't think we ever had a category, but when you talk about implicit racism, we would always have certain managers who we knew had this racism, whatever you want to call it, in hiring practices. And so to get around it, what they would do is instead of hiring the most qualified, they would just hire a black person who wasn't qualified for the job and say, see, I'm not racist, see, I hired. No, you are adding to it because you hired someone that's not qualified for the job, and once that's discovered in the job, then people will come back and say, see, that's how those black people are, they can't think, you know. So it was always hard to try to get that message across to hold, yeah, we want diversity in the organization or what have you, but don't go to the extreme where you're hiring people because you're just feeding right into that stereotype about black people not being prepared, not as intelligent. You're feeding into that. And that was the most difficult thing to try to get that across to managers from the human resource plans on diversity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. That's evidence right from a hiring department that this is really complex, and that the people doing the hiring probably thought they were doing something good by promoting DEI, and yet there can be these insidious counter effects that aren't intended, but that result in deepening the problem. This can be so scary that we just don't act, right? I think one threat here is that it just seems so pervasive, so insidious, that there's no sense to even try. But I think there we need something like a kind of courage to not only try things, but also to receive feedback whenever it's leading to effects that we don't intend. There's no way to get this right on the first run. The best we can do is make loving efforts and respond to new evidence as it becomes clear that what we thought was doing good was actually doing evil. This is the risk of being a human and trying to do well.
I think I heard that you mentioned that once we become aware of our biases, that they can actually grow stronger in the very attempts to pretend we don't have them. Is that right?
Yes.
So what are you learning about what do we do once we become aware of our biases, which is a step, I think, an important step, a necessary step, but then the very act of trying to live with those biases, or is it possible to have our biases change, diminish, because we're learning this about ourselves? I'm just curious where that goes next.
No, that's a great question, and there is research by social psychologists to show that these can be changed. These are not permanent or static or with you forever. These tests, these mechanisms for changing them usually means like watching a Denzel Washington video where you see a positive black character that then will reduce anti-black bias. And this will work for about 24 to 48 hours. And then when the person comes back a week later, a month later, a year later, the biases have gone right back. So they can change. It's demonstrable that they're changeable. But when we live in a world that is continually flooding us with images of black people as gang members, as unintelligent, et cetera, even the good faith effort to try to transform them in small doses is meeting up against these apocalyptic powers that keep forcing evil upon us. So can we change them? Yes. Are there ways, though, to live with them even as they persist? And so in some cases, there are kind of race-blind hiring practices where a candidate will be assessed without noticing their race. In schools and higher ed, there's been a move towards grading papers without the student's name visible. Simply when I was in England studying, we just put our student ID on the papers and there was no reference to us, so that the professor didn't have our race, gender, class, et cetera show up. And so this might be a way to bracket these at least and get it something more closer to a just evaluation of candidates. But of course, as long as there are interviews, as long as there are people giving, like, engaging each other in real life, these things are going to be at play.
Yeah, I guess pretty when I think about it too, and my implicit biases, because my hope, I always thinking of like my children, like if I can think about my implicit biases and change that for my children, that there might be hope for the future. Like, when I grew up, there was this riddle about being a doctor and being a woman, and the joke about it was everyone thought the doctor was a man. And I told the same riddle to my kids, and they're like, no, it's wrong. It's obviously the woman. And I realized, like, oh my God, the next generation is so much better than me. Thank God. You know, and I hope the same way can be with the racism too. Like, I hope that if we are acknowledging it and we can show them Denzel Washington videos every day, I don't know. But at least that maybe we have hope that the children can do better with us. Maybe.
You also say you got a closed mind and you're not open to, changing those, then, it's not gonna happen.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think this intergenerational point is a good one. Racial biases, implicit racial biases they do change over time. They do change as the environment changes. And so as the US becomes a more racially just place, if that's happening, presumably these biases will follow suit, right? And this also, it should be said, it doesn't mean that we can't do anything good. It just means that even as we do good things, these biases are still lurking in the background. So not to get too high on our horses, the kind of note about self-righteousness earlier is a good one, that even the morally upright among us still carry these, and so that we shouldn't get too comfortable knowing that, thinking that we've got this all sorted out. How did you do it?
Because I'm not sure exactly how to articulate this, but this is why I'm so grateful for the perspective of that, looking at this as sin, is that because, we are people empowered by the Spirit of God, we are freed to just try. We can try our best, even knowing all of the implicit problems, even knowing the great structural problems. We can just try and walk in love and know that when we fall down, when we fail, we throw ourselves on the grace of God and trust that the Holy Spirit is still at work in the world, and this is not on us individually to solve. And continue to do good.
Yeah. Sounds like the gospel. Seriously, I think that part of my concern here is that, especially on the left, you probably heard it in my sermon today, there is a concern that if we just bear down hard enough on this and we just are serious enough about race and kind of make this the thing we think about all the time from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, we can fix this. And I just don't think that's true. I think that if it is going to be sorted out, it will be because we take risks that might actually mean doing something wrong and having to prove ourselves worthy of responding to the feedback that we get from people that are harmed by even well-meaning action. But a life that is so kind of frenetically scrupulous, as I said in the sermon, about just getting it right and not trying anything until we've got it all sorted out, isn't a life in the Spirit of God that actually empowers us to love in ways that might put our moral standing at risk. Oh, yes. Thank you, Matt.
This is kind of personal, but it's kind of, I guess, an example of how a strength of someone can be, in some ways, a source of bias. And I have this bias not only against persons of color, but other persons. I'm an English major, I'm a writer, and when people have a bad way of speaking or using bad grammar, an immediate response is just, I get angry, I don't like it, I don't like them. And it's there,
And I'm trying to conquer it. I think I'm more aware of when it happens, but it's something that, it's good, but it has a bad side,
Yeah, thank you for being honest with that. It's not easy to kind of share these things. We all have these, and we all feel them. And this is a real question in grading. When you're grading student papers and grammar is not following the Queen's English, by what right do we have to mark students on grammatical formulations, idiom use? I think this happens too for people from the South. There's a kind of sense that Southern accents indicate unintelligence. Of course, there's plenty of people in the South that are plenty brilliant, yet these things keep living. And I appreciate you mentioning that. Yeah.
Struggles with the microphone again, if you just see that. I think also what complicates this issue is that there are also other sorts of biases in place. It's not just an implicit racial bias. There could be an implicit gender bias. So it's not just, I don't think we can just isolate this one thing and say, well, this is the problem and we're going to solve it. Because it's layered. There are many, many, many implicit biases that we don't realize we have. I did take one of those tests, 5 or 6 years ago. It was really interesting, and found out I have some.
Yeah. You and the rest of us. And you're right that they come in many types. Gender, sexuality, obesity, biases, there's all kinds. Ability. Yeah, Marlis.
Just to forewarn you, Mrs. Jiggerman was saying that she had taken one of these tests. Guess who else uses these? Market research firms. Whole lots of them. I had to administer several of them, and you didn't know if it was one way or the other for the product, or trying to change their minds about the image of the company. So don't think those are just social workers doing those tests. It's those guys who want, what else? What do you think? What's new?
Right. Yeah, thank you. This is what makes advertising so compelling, is that these folks know a lot more about us than we even know about ourselves, what we prefer and what we don't. Friends, I think that concludes the class. So I just want to take a moment to thank you, first off, for all of your several weeks of attention and these really good questions. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope it's been helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.